Hi guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. I'm your host Lorfarius, and for this week we shall be stepping back in time to have a look at the Lost Vikings. But before we do that, let's have a look at a couple of news items that have caught my attention this week. The first up was an article over on oldschoolgameblog.com. And they were basically having a look at something called the Bug Joystick. Now, this was something from back in the day, which pretty much, as its name entails, it looks a bit like a bug, but it always looked a bit like a snail shell to me. It was a very, very odd joystick to play with, and I was not the biggest fan. It's certainly not something I would go back to today, but they did do quite a close look at it, and quite extensive, told a bit of a story about it, a bit of history as well, so I shall post a link to that in the show notes. It's well worth a look. Next up is probably some of the biggest Amiga news I've ever seen. Basically, someone's gone and converted Doom 2 for the Amiga CD of 32. Now, the incredible thing about this is that it just runs off a stock, I think, CD32, and it just uses fast RAM to run, but it's got all the levels in there. Everything's been converted. They do say in the blurb that it cannot be used with any other first-person shooter game. I think it's the limitations of the engine and so on. But one thing they have done is strip away all like the CLI loading gubbins, as it says on the actual page, and all the loading screen stuff. You pretty much just boot it up on the CD32 as a standard CD, and it just completely blew me away because, you know, back in the day it was like, can we get Doom on an Amiga? And of course you couldn't, you know, and there was no sort of like 3D shooters or anything until pretty much when the system was either on its way out or dying with the Alien Breed shooter game. So it's just interesting that guy's been able to go back and convert Doom properly. Well, sorry, Doom 2 rather. Maybe they have done Doom. Have we mentioned that on the show before? I can't remember. It's always good to see that the Amiga's got a pretty long-lasting life. I mean, usually when I'm looking at news items and stuff, there's loads of things to go over. And again, I've only mentioned a couple this week, but just the fact I can still find news items all these years later is incredible itself. Of course, if you have any news that you want to recommend or stuff that you want me to have a look at, then by all means, send me an email to lorfarius@amigarama.com, or even if you have any other suggestions like interviews or articles and just bits and bobs I might never come across just random browsing across the internet. I'm interested in everything you can suggest, so drop me a line, guys. And with that, it's time to move on to this week's game. And for this week, we are covering The Lost Vikings. Now, I don't really have much of a history with this at all, to be honest. I mean, I think I played it on the SNES back in the day, but I think that was a rented cartridge at the time. But I don't think I ever really got to play it on the Amiga or experience it in person. But I mean, even at the time, I vaguely remember lots of advertising and people raving about it in different magazines. You know, it was highly recommended and stuff. Unless I only ever played it on the SNES, but coming back to it on the Amiga, I was really hoping for something special because, again, it's got lots of coverage at the time and people really seem to like it. So, yeah, let's dig in. The publisher behind it was Interplay. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with them. They're a huge company. They did things like Battle Chess, Star Trek 25th Anniversary, and Out of This World, amongst other things. I mean, I could spend half an hour just reading through lots and lots of different games that they did. It was developed by Silicon and Synapse. Again, they did Battle Chess 2, Castles, Lord of the Rings Volume 1. I think that was like an RPG. I'm not entirely sure. I think I played that one as well as a kid, and very vague memories of it, but that might be worth revisiting because I bet there's loads of Lord of the Rings games on the Amiga. I mean, if there's a Volume 1 there must have been a 2 and a 3 or something like that. It came out in 1993. Now, there was only ever an A500, so that's ECS OCS version. There was a later release in 94 for the CD32. Originally, it came on 2 discs for ECS, OCS, and a single CD for the 32. Price-wise, $29.99. That does seem a bit expensive, especially for 93, when lots of other games were about $25.99 at the time. Anyway, I'm not sure what happened there. It's single player. Now, the coder behind this is James Edward Analt III. He was involved in the battle chess games, in particular the second one and Castles, but then mainly just this. The graphics people, I mean, there was a list of 9 different people for this, which is one hell of a lot of a team if you think about it. I mean, usually you get like 2 or 3 people and that's it, but I didn't want to start listing loads and loads of names because we'd be at it all day. But they only seem to work on other interplay games from what I could see from looking into them. Now, here's something really special. The music was done in particular by Alistair Brimble. I mean, I've mentioned him many times before, because he was probably one of the best people for tunes back on the MIGI in the day. So back in the day, I almost said it. I've had somebody actually make a comment saying, "You do seem to say back in the day too many times." It's like a mental tick. I can't seem to help it. Anyway, Alistair did lots of games for Team 17, Ocean, Virgin Games. He was pretty much across all the main publishers, come out with some really fantastic stuff at the time. He was also assisted by Charles Deenan. He was also behind Death Trap. I think that's like a platform game. I vaguely remember seeing that recently. The Lord of the Rings game we mentioned before, Stormlord, a huge list of them. They seem to be mostly Team 17 games and the odd bit for Silicon and Synapse. It was converted to the GBA, the SNES, PC/DOS, or Mega Drive or Genesis if you're over in the US. One of the interesting things I didn't realise at the time when I was looking into them, but later found out, was that Silicon and Synapse actually became Blizzard Entertainment, which in itself is quite amazing to think about, really, because I think this was before all like the Warcraft stuff and where they were really getting into that fantasy type element. So it's interesting to see where they actually came from in the early days. The game itself was originally meant to be a Lemmings-like game, just using little Vikings and guiding them off to the death. I mean, originally it also had 5 characters, but they cut that down because it was becoming too complicated and chose 3. I think the interesting thing about this is, I mean, originally it was just literally like Lemmings. It was that sort of a puzzle game, but as it developed and they realised from the graphics and the amount of effort they were putting in, it was actually better to expand it and come up with something completely different. But even though they cut down the 5 characters, the 3 they were left with make perfect sense. And some notes I found: all the levels within the game, I think it's 37 in total, were designed on graph paper. There was a few examples and pictures online, and like really amazing stuff that they've drawn. It reminded me of like the Dizzy games, in particular the Fantasy World Dizzy ones that the Oliver twins had done, which is pretty much, it's available online, but lots and lots of like retro game museums in the UK display that on a regular basis. I've seen it in person myself a few years ago. Absolutely fantastic. But anyway, that's an aside. But I always love finding old documents like this, because back then, you know, it was all by hand. There was none of this stuff. It was all just slung on a computer, but it was all done pen and paper, and there's actual physical things to see. The characters from Lost Vikings also appeared, they make guest appearances rather, in World of Warcraft, so they've not forgotten the roots there. One thing that did interest me, because it usually seems to be the other way around, but the Amiga version is actually a port of the SNES game. They actually said in an interview that the SNES version was the main game. That's what they were pushing for. And as it later went on through development and stuff, and they realised, well, we can push this onto other systems. So yeah, we got the leftovers on the Amiga, I'm afraid. Over on the SNES, it did have a sequel in 1997. From what I could tell, that doesn't seem to have reviewed reviewed as well. They've updated the graphics a bit, made a few tweaks and changes to the levels and stuff. It seems okay. It just as a game, though, it wasn't impressive. I think it got like 60 and 70%. People didn't think it were anything amazing, but it's just interesting to see that there is actually a sequel. Sadly, the Amiga didn't get any sort of follow-up. You just got the one game and out. And also, from what I could see of this, it took 11 months to develop. But despite being very fondly remembered by pretty much all sort of gaming communities these days, it wasn't really a big seller, and it just wasn't very popular at the time. But there was a huge advertisement, because I can still remember it to this day. So that was a very, very strange thing to come across. Now, the plot for this is quite straightforward. It's not exactly Shakespeare or anything that in depth. But basically, 3 Vikings, Erik the Swift, Baleog the Fierce, and Olaf the Stout, are kidnapped by an enemy called Tomator, Emperor of the alien Croutonian Empire, for an intergalactic zoo. They are able to escape the ship, but get lost in various periods of time. They must traverse various bizarre locations and eventually confront and defeat Tomator to find their way home. Now, the great thing about this is when you first start the game, there's a full-on introduction movie, basically like the game is playing out itself, and you see them using their various abilities and skills and what they're actually capable of doing. It's quite an interesting way of doing it, and it plays out like it's almost like a cutscene effectively, and you see the UFO swoop in and take them. And these are just Vikings at the end of the day, and nothing spectacular, and then it pulls you up into the air and then takes you aboard the spaceship to enjoy the rest of the adventure. As a game, this is a puzzle platformer, and in that sense, it's a typical looking 2D platformer. You got your play area, you have a bar across the top of the screen, you can see all 3 characters on there, each of which can hold up to 4 items. You can also bin unwanted ones, a little icon off to the side, and you also got 3 energy bars, or hit points as it were, for each characters. The characters themselves are very well drawn. They're actually quite big, I thought, looking at them on the screen. They take up a huge chunk in each corner. But despite the size, they are actually extremely fluid and very responsive to control. You know, they move quite well with the controller or the joystick. You can, if you want, just use the keyboard, but as always, I'll always use a control pad. But you do need to use a mix of keys to go with it, because in order to select the different items and use your different weapon types and so on, get to that in a second, you have to flick between the 2. Now, of course, you've got 3 characters. Baleog the Fierce, who uses a sword and has a second weapon, which is arrows. He's a green guy with nice flowing locks of hair. He's very muscly. Erik the Swift with red long flowing ponytails. He can jump and ram walls with his head. That just sounds very, very bizarre. Then there's the fat one, which is, well, I suppose he's not a fat one. He's a bit muscly, but Olaf the Stout, who can use a shield. He can pretty much block any incoming attacks with that, and then if he drops off a height, you can just hold it above your head, and then he will float down when falling. It is possible to die in this game by dropping off a height. Either you lose a bit of health, or if it's too far, you do actually die. So having that shield there with Olaf does actually help. Each of the levels are based around all 3 characters having to get to the exit. But the thing is, because they've all got these different skills, you have to use it together. And it's simple things like opening doors, arrows for switches, blocking enemies with the shield, jumping over great distances. And a lot of the puzzles, you do have to use them quite well. In one instance, particularly, you can have Olaf lift his shield up in the air, then you can have Erik come bounding across and then bounce between platforms and then bounce off him and across and away. That sounds a bit too simplistic, but a lot of the puzzles are actually set up like this. Now, as I said before, there are 37 levels in total. They're set across various areas. You've got like a spaceship area, a desert, forest, an Egyptian area, construction site, all sorts of alien worlds. One of them looked almost candy-like with chocolate bars and things. Now, you do actually get to use like time travel between the actual levels, and that might sound a bit odd. It's not like going to a hub world. It's like you get to the end of the level and it's all part of the story, but you get a little gate, and it always reminds me of Stargate in a way, and then you look through and you can see like a little wormhole off in the background. You jump through and it takes you to somewhere else, but it just works as a very neat way of explaining how bizarre it is and just how strange, if you think about it, how all these worlds, none of them link together, none of them really make any sense, but by having that time travel sort of explanation there, it does work quite well. Of course, with 37 levels, you'd expect some sort of ability to save. You haven't got that, but you do have a password system. Password system's nice and simple. It's only like 4 characters long. It's a mix of letters and numbers. Now, one of the great things about this game that you really can't see without experiencing it yourself, but there's a lot of banter between the characters. They talk to each other usually at the end or the beginning of a level, and it's little speech bubbles that pop up above their heads, and they're all different colours, so it's very easy to work out who they're talking to. But a couple of examples of this, like one of them was, if I bash one more wall, my head will explode. I've got dibs on his helmet. Another one would be, I'm having a terrible time. Not me, I'm getting to clobber some monsters. Now that just sounds very simplistic and childlike, and it is to some degree, but a lot of these do happen on a regular basis, and it really makes you appreciate the characters. They don't just feel like simple mascots or just you're bounding through levels with something on the screen, but you actually get to pause and have a chuckle at what they're saying. And I actually, a fair few of the jokes they were doing actually had me chuckling to myself or laughing on one or two occasions. It was just really bizarre, especially for like a 16-bit era game, to see something like that. I'm not really used to that, and I think it draws you into the world and the experience that they're going through, and then you just feel a part of it, because you're having to get involved and work out the puzzles and stuff through each levels, and it just works really, really well. Now, one of the other funny things about it, because there's lots and lots of humour dotted throughout this game, but one of the things in particular is usually in games like this, if you leave the controller for a few minutes, they'll start doing daft movements and things like that. But some of these, when you do, like, they'll be stood there picking the nose, flexing muscles, tying shoelaces, farting away. It's just very, very childish and simple, but it did make me laugh at rather peculiar times, and again, it just got me more involved than I should be for what is effectively a puzzle platform. The characters felt almost real. It was very, very bizarre. Now, of course, there was some absolutely fantastic music with this. I mean, with Alistair Brimble behind it, I mean, what do you expect? What do you expect? But the opening theme on this, when you first start the game off, and it kicks in, and it's almost like drums and a beat and a rapid, and it's cool for the time. It's almost like a dance track, but with a touch of Viking music mixed in. It's very, very odd, and I thought it was one of my favourite pieces of music experience in a long time on the Amiga, and it really did put other Amiga games to shame. But the fantastic thing is as well that every single level through this has actually got game music, and which is what you want. I mean, a lot of others just don't bother. They might have like a main intro, a couple of levels with a bit of music dotted around, and that's it. But this is full of music from beginning to end. The puzzles themselves, they're all pretty straightforward. There's nothing really complicated. A few of the levels were head scratching, because you've got to plan ahead. You have to time things sometimes. It might be simple things like shooting an arrow across a pit and then having to jump across with the other character. I mean, to select the characters, you just bang in tab to move. Oh, is it left shift? Oh my god, sorry, I've just completely messed it. It's a key press anyway. It flicks between the characters, and a lot. You can time that quite well, but it can seem a bit off when you're trying to use the keyboard and the joystick together. But I mean, there was nothing really too taxing, and I think if you put your mind to it, you could probably get through this in about 4 or 5 hours of gameplay. So there is a lot going on. Now, throughout the levels, there's lots of different enemies. They're all like area dependent, so there's a good selection. Again, comparing it to different games I've covered in the past, they tend to have like a limited number of enemies going on. But I was quite surprised here, just that even though it's only like 37 levels, there's a lot of different choices, and you do come up across quite a few enemies. and it really does help to expand the game out a bit. Now, of course, it does have its problems. One of the biggest issues I had with it is there's no two-player. I would have quite liked to have the opportunity to play this on, say, Amiga Live or something, but it's entirely single-player. And looking at the game, it is a puzzle platformer. It's quite strange that you can't choose to have another player there or to get involved. Yes, there's the option in the sense that you could pass the joystick onto another person, but then that's still single player. But you just think there could have been a much cleverer way. They could have maybe had something like a multiplayer version, or maybe something off the main menu where you have two people working together, either have two sticks or using the keyboard and stuff. I don't know. I don't know. I feel that just having single player there, it's just a bit of a waste, really, and it wouldn't have been too difficult for them to come up with something better. I mean, maybe it might have sold more off the back of that. Now, I did say there's 37 levels, and maybe that sounds like a lot, but the thing is, most of the levels, once you've got through them, there's not a lot of gameplay skill once you've solved the puzzles and killed the enemies, because none of the enemies are too taxing or over the top, and it's not like littered with bosses throughout all the stages, because it's basically a puzzle game, which is fine. But the thing is, it just doesn't feel expansive enough. There's not enough going on there in them 37 levels. There isn't enough to draw you back later to keep playing them through and exploring and things like that. There are some hidden bits here and there, like hidden rooms and stuff where you can sneak through walls here and there and maybe blow stuff up with some of the items. Like, there's a few items dotted around, like fruit, things for health, and bombs and area destroy on the screen, but none of them really are puzzle solutions or anything. There's like keys dotted around. There's nothing too over the top there or really clever in the items that it collects, so it needed a bit more, I suppose. One of the biggest problems I also had is that in order to see everything within a level, I mean, that's fine once you know your way around the game, but at first you have to do it in person. And what I mean by that is, in like Lemmings, you can pretty much just stop doing whatever you're doing and then move the mouse cursor to the left or right and then scroll back and forth. On this, I mean, you need to do that a lot of the time because there's a lot of like blind jumps and areas which might be difficult, and you could do with just scrolling the screen around, and there's no option. It just doesn't let you do it, and it's very well having to move the characters down there, but in some instances, you're a level or a gap can be like quite huge, and it's a bit of a blind jump, and the problem is your character dies, and this adds on to another problem, because if your character dies and you've got to restart a level. It doesn't make you restart a level, but you need to get them all through, and there is infinite lives effectively, so it doesn't always sound as bad as I'm saying there, but the problem is when you do die at the end of the level, or all three of them die, you get to see an animation where there's like a Viking ship going out to sea in the middle of the night under the moon, which is on fire because all the bodies are burning, very, very dramatic. But the problem is it makes you watch that every single time, and I couldn't see a way of skipping it. I was banging the keys and stuff, so you have to watch that. It's only about probably 8-9 seconds long, something like that, but when you've seen it umpteen times because you've got stuck on a particular point and you're trying to work your way through, there's also no like checkpoints or anything through the levels, which was a bit of a problem. Another issue I did have, you probably won't experience this yourselves unless you're using either ADFs to load it or the original discs, but the disc loading was horrendous, and I was so glad when I was doing the gameplay footage that I was actually able to put it to turbo mode, because it seems like it takes about 15 minutes to load the levels, but some of these levels, it must be absolutely, you think, it's going to be absolutely huge, and it's not. It's just incredibly slow to load from the disc. It's just a bit frustrating. Another thing with it as well, I did say before, there's no way, you can't save the game. You do get nice simple passwords, but it's literally just like a level access. You're not actually saving anything. It's not that complex, and I just think, well, maybe if they could have easily added an option, because I'd just like the opportunity to just stick a disc, or save that way, even save to the hard drive. And one other thing, it's not hard drive installable. Luckily these days we can just use WHD load to get around it, but I can see this back in the day would have been quite frustrating, especially with me super duper 20 meg hard drive. My god. Also looking into the game, there was no AGA version. Even though they released a CD32 version, I was pretty much playing them side by side and I couldn't see any noticeable improvements. There is not like any souped up AGA graphics or anything. It's a bit cheap, to be honest, unless I'm missing something. I also tried playing two versions side by side. I did this on YouTube video because I wanted to see if there was a difference in the music, and I couldn't see any. It's not like they've added full-on CD tracks or anything like that, unless I'm missing something and there was something wrong on the videos that I was watching. But that's just a bit annoying, really, and a tad frustrating. Now, there's also a lot of puzzles in this where it's a sort of speed reliant, where you have to flick between the characters and do things in a specific order. And in order to do this, you're having to use the joystick, the keyboard, and some of the keys are dotted a fair bit out, and it's very, very fiddly. And once you know your way around the controls and it clicks, sort of, it does work together, but it's not perfect by any means. And a lot of the things you just think, well, couldn't they just have had like a simple, like a menu select? If you tap down, say, and press fire, or held fire and press down, it would maybe open the menu or something like that. I don't know, just something less frustrating than having to keep flicking back and forth. I mean, again, I suppose back in the day, it wasn't much of it. Back in the day, I'm using it again. I really am sorry for that. But it wouldn't have been a problem then, I suppose, because you've been sat right over the keyboard. But these days, when you're more used to everything being based around the controls, it can be a tad frustrating to go back to these days and to have to deal with it. Overall, though, I mean, none of those are like huge, massive issues. They're just little niggles, really, and there's nothing there that really brings the game down. Now, the magazines, I'm not going to say it back in the day, but the magazines at the time, they were quite favourable with the reviews. Amiga Action gave it 91%. The One gave it 90, Amiga Power 87%, again really, really high scores. Amiga Computing 84, CU Amiga 82, and then Amiga Format was probably the lowest at 79%. Now, most of those are quite alright, 8 and 9 out of 10 effectively. Quite understandable, because it's a pretty good game, but I couldn't understand real Amiga formats. I mean, when I was reading the review, they're not really down there or anything, it's just a few little grumbles, pretty much like what I had, but again, it's not enough to bring it down to what would be an average game, especially at the time. The game is just tremendous fun. It's funny, it's entertaining, it's a bit of a chuckle watching the story play out. It was a real joy to play. I mean, it's not like up there, say, with like one of the greatest puzzle platformers ever. I'm not even sure what that sort of game would be. Maybe something like Super Mario World. I mean, it's not to that degree, but what you're presented with, it looks fine, it sounds great, the levels are just about big enough as individual levels. There's not enough there for content. It could have probably done with an extra disc. I'm not sure why it's so limited in that way, especially when you're flying about through time and space and stuff, so they could have easily just tied in a few more levels in the middle there and a bit more humour. I really, really love these characters though. I mean, you really get to know them as you're travelling around on a little adventure, and it's just absolutely fantastic. The banter that they have and the way they bounce off one another and take the mickey out of each other. And it's just, I'm not used to this from this era of games. There's just nothing like it at the time. If anyone's like familiar with stuff like that I've been missing out on, by all means, come and drop me a line, because I want to play more stuff like this. It's a real shame that there's no actual sequel to it, because I would have liked to see their adventure carry on. But on the Amiga, again, there is the SNES version. I might pay a trip back to that just to see these characters. I'm not I'm not really spoiling the game, but I'm not going to tell you what the ending is. But there's part at the end where they finally make it home. They make it back to the families, and they're talking to their wives and kids and stuff. And there's a little joke there, and then they just say, "Oh, look what we brought back from the future," and they pull out like electric guitar and drums, and it just bonkers. It just works so well. I mean, they're in the middle of nowhere. It's like the Dark Ages or something, and they're all banging away on drums. Anyway, as you can probably tell, I was just highly entertained. Now, the graphics aren't going to win any rewards. They're perfectly functional. Everything looks quite well drawn. I like the layout of the levels and all the different backgrounds and surrounds and stuff. The thing is, the characters are quite big on the screen, and they are very well drawn and animated, especially when they're doing like some of the humorous things. And, you know, you really, there's no problems there on the graphical front. I mean, it is disappointing there's no like AGA version. I don't know why they didn't come back later and do something extra special. I mean, it's even with a CD32, you've got all that space on the disc, and they could have stuck some more levels in there, but sadly there's just nothing there. But again, that music from the game though is just, that's award winning, especially that opening theme. I'd recommend you go and track that down or hunt it down on YouTube, because it's absolutely fantastic stuff. This really was a pleasant surprise. I had a great time playing through it, and I think in future I'll probably return back to it. I might give it a year or two just to let the puzzles ease off a bit and come at it fresh, something like that. But yeah, I had a great time with it. And I think that's the perfect time to finish. As always, if you want to see some gameplay footage of this, you can pop over to AMIGArama.com. I put some up every week. Or follow the show on Twitter at AMIGAramaPod, or even drop us a line on the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/AMIGArama. Anyway, until next time, guys.